Imagine spending nearly 2 decades of your life building a revolutionary technology, only to have a kid who can barely tie his own shoes tell you that your life's work belongs to him now, and you're just a footnote in a corporate filing. The hum of the fluorescent lights in Lab 7 was the only thing I could hear when my keycard finally gave up on me. My name is Ethan Cross. I'm 48 years old, and I've spent the last 17 years of my life pouring every ounce of energy into a breakthrough that was just handed over to a guy who probably couldn't tell a battery from a brick. Brandon Hale, the CEO's 31-year-old nephew, was leaning against my personal workbench like he owned the place when he told me to hit the bricks without even having the decency to stand up straight. He explained that all the rights to my volt-edge solid-state technology were being moved under his family's corporate umbrella, and that my time as a consultant was officially up. He told me they appreciated my contributions, like I was some intern who brought in donuts instead of the guy who pioneered the most advanced power source on the face of the earth. Voltage wasn't just another product to me. It was a total game changer that I'd engineered molecule by molecule for nearly 20 years. The energy density we achieved was 3 times higher than anything else on the market, and every major car company in the world was practically begging for a license. The government even locked down parts of the research for national security reasons, and I'm sitting there with over $2 billion in patents all in my name, while this kid in his shiny Italian loafers tells me my help was appreciated. None of the other 6 engineers in the room would even look me in the eye. Not even Dr. Reeves, who I'd written papers with, or Janet Miller from the patent office, or even Kevin Park, who only had a career, because I'd spent 5 years pulling him through his own failed experiments until he finally hit his stride. I took off my badge and dropped it on the bench right next to a prototype that still smelled like the electrolyte solution I'd mixed myself. Derek was just watching me, probably waiting for me to scream, or cry, or pull some kind of scene like they teach you in management school. Instead, I just looked at him and asked if his legal team had actually bothered to walk him through Section 14C of my original contract. He looked at me with a blank stare for a second and said, "Their lawyers were top-notch and the whole transition was clean." So I just nodded my head and grabbed my bag and told him if that's the case, he had absolutely nothing to worry about. I took one last look at that lab where I'd basically lived since I was 31 years old and told him to enjoy the power, but to keep a close eye on the gauges. Because when the charge runs out, it happens a lot faster than you think. None of them had a clue what I was really saying, but they were going to find out soon enough back in 2008 when Pennington Energy was just a tiny operation in a converted warehouse in Newark. The co-founder, Dr. Laura Bennett, and I made sure to put something very specific in my employment paperwork. Helen was a real chemist who understood that you can't separate the person who builds the formula from the formula itself. We called it the dead man's cell protocol, and it was a simple concept buried deep in technical fine print that corporate lawyers never touch because it's full of molecular science and government rules. The protocol linked my own biometrics and my retinal scan, and even my specific way of doing chemistry to every single patent in the federal system. Any change in ownership required 2 keys: my personal sign-off and a confirmation from the government patent registry, and without both of those things the system would automatically flag the patents as disputed and shut everything down in 72 hours. Helen always said that chemistry doesn't lie and molecules don't care about who's in charge. She retired a few years ago when the company started replacing the scientists with suits, and she saw the writing on the wall. Long before I did, she moved to a farm in Vermont to teach freshmen about covalent bonds, rather than watching a bunch of MBAs wreck what we built. I drove home that night through the Newark traffic and past the old warehouse, which is a vape shop now, and felt the weight of 17 years just floating away. My apartment is pretty small, but I kept one room as a private lab that never touched the company network, and that was the smartest move I ever made. I have all my original notes and my terminal linked right to the Department of Energy, so I sat down and checked the system and saw that the dead man's cell protocol was already ticking away in the background. The 72-hour countdown had started the second Derek filed that paperwork without my thumbprint, and now the clock was running out on Pennington Energy. It was almost midnight when my phone rang, and I saw an unknown number. It was Janet Miller from the patent office whispering like she was in trouble, and she asked if they knew about Section 14C. I told her they didn't, as I watched the clock hit 71 hours and 14 minutes. She told me Derek is planning a massive media circus for the morning to claim they own Voltage outright. She said the stock is already soaring, but I just told her that tomorrow was going to be a very big lesson for everyone involved. She tried to warn them, but the head lawyer just tossed my contract in the trash and called it old paperwork. But some people still remember who actually built the place, and then the line went dead. There's nothing quite like the feeling of watching a man who's never worked a day in his life try to take credit for 17 years of your sweat and blood while you sit there and smile because you know something he doesn't. I spent a long time sitting in the dark just listening to my machines hum and thinking about the 17 years I put into this project. I'm talking about 4,000 separate experiments and over 200 failed prototypes before I finally got the Voltage. Right? Plus another 9 months of no sleep, just to get the government to sign off on the security clearance. Then you've got a guy like Brandon Hale who graduated from business school 2 years ago with a fancy degree, and he thinks he can just swipe all of that with a signature and a nod from his uncle. Let me tell you about Derek. The kid had never even stepped inside a laboratory until his uncle gave him a corner office. He wouldn't know what to do with a beaker or how to fix a spectrometer if his life depended on it, and he sure as hell never pulled an all-nighter trying to stop an electrolyte from falling apart under high heat. But the kid could talk like a pro, using all those big corporate buzzwords like synergistic value and paradigm shifts. He'd stand there in his expensive suits and make my life's work sound like some idea he had. While eating breakfast, the engineers used to laugh about it behind his back in the break room, because we all knew the truth. My buddy Tommy once said that Derek couldn't even swap out a flat tire, but he could definitely sell you a 40-page presentation on the future of car maintenance. We all thought it was a joke back then, but nobody was laughing when he started firing people on the second day. I went to the diner right across from the main office at a little before 9 in the morning. I sat in a corner booth with a cup of black coffee watching that big glass tower Richard built with the money my batteries brought in, and it felt strange looking at a building I basically paid for, but couldn't even walk into anymore. I looked up at the TV, and there was Derek on the news looking all polished in a blue suit with a little flag pin on his chest. He was up there at a podium telling the whole world that Pennington Energy now officially owned the Volt Edge platform and that it was going to change. Everything from the cars we drive to the national power grid. I just sat there sipping my bitter coffee while he talked about visionary leadership, like he'd been doing this for decades, instead of just 23 months. The stock market was going crazy and the news anchors were calling it the deal of the century. The waitress came by to top off my cup and asked if I worked there, and I just told her I used to a long time ago. By that afternoon, my phone was blowing up with texts from the younger engineers asking if I'd really signed away the rights they were hearing Derek take credit for the invention, and they knew it was all a lie, but I didn't say a word back because they'd find out the truth soon enough anyway. Later that evening, a courier dropped off a fancy envelope inviting me to a celebration dinner at the Meridian Club, which is the kind of high-end place where Richard goes to feel important. They called it a legacy event, which made me feel like they were already planning my funeral. Put on my best charcoal suit but skipped the tie because I wanted to be comfortable while I watched the show. When I got there, Derek greeted me like we were old pals and told me he was glad I could make it, since I was so instrumental in the early stages. The nerve of this kid calling my life's work the early stages when I was the one who actually built it. I just told him I appreciated the invite and that it was nice to be remembered. There were about 20 people at the table with Derek sitting at the head and Richard right next to him looking like he'd just bought the world's priciest toy for his nephew. The lawyers were all young guys with watches that cost more than my ride acting like they were guarding a king. I sat in the middle so I could watch everyone while we drank wine that probably cost $800 a bottle. Richard made a big toast to innovation and the family name, and then Derek got up looking like it was Christmas morning. He told everyone that Voltage was finally fully theirs, and that it was the future of the company. I put my fork down and mentioned that getting everything integrated is the hard part, because chemistry is a fickle thing. I told him he better make sure the government paperwork was solid, because the Department of Energy doesn't play games with these patents. You could see a few people get nervous, and Derek's smile started to fade just a bit, even though he insisted his lawyers had it covered. I just went back to my steak and reminded him to double-check those security protocols before the 72-hour window ran out, because once those automatic safeguards kick in, the lights go out pretty fast. I said it real casual, like I was just giving him a friendly tip, but I could tell Richard was starting to get worried because he just stopped eating and stared at me right then and there. Most people think a billion-dollar company dies because of a bad market or a better product, but sometimes it just takes one man with a laptop and a grudge to pull the plug and watch the whole thing turn to dust in the morning light. Richard had that old-school instinct that tells a man when the floor is about to drop out from under him, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. Even while Derek was laughing and acting like he'd already won the lottery, they were halfway through some fancy chocolate dessert when a server walked up and handed Derek a phone saying the Department of Energy Compliance office was on the line and needed him right then and there. The whole table went dead quiet while the kid stepped out into the hallway, and I just sat there watching him through the glass as his back went stiff as a board, and he started shaking his head like he was trying to argue with a brick wall. He was out there for 7 minutes, and when he finally walked back in, the kid looked like he'd just seen a ghost. He tried to force a smile and tell his uncle it was just a routine check, but his hands were shaking so hard he could barely keep his wine in. The glass, I didn't stick around to see him crumble. I just folded my napkin and told everyone at that table they better keep their phones charged because tomorrow was going to be the kind of day they'd never forget. Richard caught me by the arm on my way out and asked what I'd done, but I just looked him in the eye and told him I hadn't done a thing except build my tech the right way and protect it even better. By midnight, I was sitting out on my balcony with the Newark skyline spread out in front of me, and I could see the Pennington Tower glowing like a neon sign because I knew every lawyer they had was in there, pulling an all-nighter trying to wrap their heads around the fine print they'd ignored for years when Richard called my personal cell. He sounded like a man who was finally starting to understand the mess he was in. He tried to play the reasonable card and told me to name my price, offering me a seat on the board and even saying they'd put my name on the front of the building, but I almost had to laugh at the idea of my name on a place I'd already paid for with 17 years of my life. So I told him I didn't want his money or his titles. I wanted his nephew to stand in front of a camera and tell the truth about how he's a fraud who never invented a single thing. Richard told me that would be career suicide for the kid, and I just told him his nephew committed suicide the second he decided an expensive suit and a family name made him a scientist. I told him he had until 6 in the morning before the chemistry caught up with him, and then I hung up the phone. I was standing at my window with a cup of coffee watching the sky turn from black to that pale gold color of a new day when the countdown on my laptop finally hit 0, and exactly at 6 o'clock I watched the Pennington Tower flicker twice before every single floor went pitch black all at once. And it wasn't just a simple power failure, it was the sound of 17 years of patents locking their doors and pulling the keys the second that protocol went live. Every car manufacturer and power grid operator and military contractor using my tech got a notification that their licenses were dead, and the ownership was under federal dispute within 20 minutes. The government had issued a shutdown order, and by the time the sun was fully up, the SEC had frozen their stock and the FBI was pulling into their parking lot to start asking the kind of questions you don't want to answer. Richard called me one last time, sounding completely broken and begging me to stop it before the whole company collapsed, but I told him the system doesn't have a pause button for fraud. I reminded him that those 3,000 employees he was so worried about now were the same ones who sat there and watched a kid steal my life's work without saying a word. So now they could all watch the fallout together. By noon, the whole world knew the name Pennington for all the wrong reasons, and I got to sit on my couch and watch the news. Footage of Derek being led out in handcuffs looking like a scared little boy while his uncle resigned in front of a crowd with the eyes of a man who just saw his entire legacy evaporate into thin air. The aftermath. Most folks think that when you win a fight, it is because you threw the biggest punch. But the truth is, you win because you were the only one who knew where the exit was before the building started to burn. Those big automaker bosses put out a joint statement saying they were shocked and disgusted by how the Pennington family lied to them which is just corporate talk for saying they are hiring a small army of lawyers to sue Derek into the Stone Age. I spent my whole afternoon at my kitchen table taking calls from people who wanted to know if I was going to buy the company or try to save all those jobs, but I told every single one of them that Pennington Energy was a ghost, and I was not interested in haunting it. The technology was the only thing that mattered, and it was not going anywhere. A new foundation. 8 months later, I am sitting in a conference room with huge windows looking out over the Delaware River. It is a bit smaller than that old glass tower, but it is clean and it is honest. The name on the door says Coal Energy Technologies, and Maya Thompson is sitting right across from me. She was a junior chemist who walked out of the old place the day after the collapse, and she showed up at my apartment with a box of research notes and a look in her eyes that told me she was not going to let our hard work die. She reminds me of how I used to be when I first started out, more interested in the way molecules behave than what the stock price is doing. She slid a folder across the table and told me the Department of Energy contract is finally official, and it is worth nearly $4 billion over the next 10 years to build batteries for the power grid and the military and the new electric car program. She told me the government specifically wants me to be the one. Leading the research, the real payday. When I opened that folder and saw the numbers, I realized we were going to make more than double what the old company ever brought in during my 17 years there, and the best part is that every cent is going to the people who actually do the heavy lifting in the lab. I asked her about the car companies, and she said all 3 of them are begging to start their partnerships over with us instead of the Penningtons, and their legal teams are already writing up the paperwork. Then she smiled and mentioned that Toyota called because they want to do a $1 billion joint venture for their next platform, since they only want to deal with the person who actually invented the tech. Imagine that settling the score. My computer made a sound, and I saw an email from the Department of Energy saying they were nominating me for a National Innovation Medal for helping with American energy security after almost 20 years of working in a warehouse. It felt good to see. The government finally put the credit where it belongs. I sent a quick note to Laura Bennett telling her that the chemistry did not lie, and she wrote back a few minutes later saying, "It never does," and that she was proud of me. I sat back and looked out at the water thinking about where everyone ended up. Derek is currently out in Arizona working at a car lot his father-in-law owns, and I bet he is learning real fast what it feels like to actually earn a commission instead of just inheriting a fortune. Richard is hiding out in a golf community in Scottsdale trying to dodge government subpoenas, while the legacy he built on my back disappears into thin air. The truth beneath the surface. The old Pennington Tower is being turned into high-end apartments now, and I drove past it the other day to see that the old logo was already gone and replaced by a big banner for luxury living. Nadia asked me if I ever think about that night at the club when Derek was acting like a king while I just sat there, eating my steak, knowing the world was about to fall on his head. I told her I always believed the formula would protect itself. But here is the thing that even Nadia does not know. I did not just happen to get lucky with that timing. I was the one who anonymously suggested to Derek's assistant that consolidating the patents was the best way to show the board he was in control, because I knew his ego would never let him read the fine print, and I was the one who sent those recordings to the FBI after I caught them talking about fraud on a hidden mic I planted in my old workbench. But the real kicker is that I am the one who bought that old tower through a shell company during the bankruptcy auction. So the man who fired me is currently paying me rent for his office space while he packs up his boxes and prepares to leave town for good. And I think that is the best kind of chemistry there is.